Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome, everyone, to Singapore GeoFest 2021, SLA 20th Anniversary Featured Talk segment. Today, we are joined by one of our guest speakers, Mr. Mok Lai Ying, a GIS and mapping consultant, who will be giving a very interesting talk about Thomson's Map of Singapore. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Mr. Mok to take us through history. Mr. Mok, please.
Oh, thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Mok Lai Ying. This is a special edition of my talk on Thomson's Maps of Singapore to commemorate SLA's 20th anniversary. Before I begin with the proper content of the talk, let me introduce you to the name Thomson. Just about 20 days ago, there was this news about the Thomson East Coast Line being, the stage 2 being opened. So the popular impression of the name Thomson is now associated with the main route, Thomson Road in Singapore. I think not many people are aware of the person that sort of like developed and opened up the route, Thomson Road. So this is my attempt to summarize his mapping efforts and surveying work in Singapore when he was appointed the government surveyor in Singapore. Okay, so this is the Thomson line, the map. It goes from Woodland North to downtown area, so there are 2 phases. So when I first gave a talk last year, the first phase was just being opened. So the 4 anniversaries, special anniversaries. The first one is the 20th anniversary of SLA. So it happened in 2001. And the second one, the significance of this talk is that this year is the bicentenary of Thomson's birth. He was born in 1841. Oh, sorry. My goodness, that was a typo. 1821. 1841 was his appointment year as the government surveyor of Singapore. Now, the significance again of the number 20. When he was appointed the first government surveyor, he was only 20 years old, as young as SLA. So it's quite an achievement in those days. And the 5th point is that this year's calendar, 2021's calendar, is the same as 1841. So today, September 17th, was also the Friday in 1841. And he was appointed on the 26th October, and whatever that day will be, it will be the same day as this year. And he came to Singapore on the 1st of November in 1841 to take up his post. And he started work on the 7th of November, 1841. So that was 118 years ago. Before I begin with the Thomson's maps, let me review a little bit on SLA's original constituent agencies. There were 4 agencies that formed SLA. First was the Survey Department, the second one was the Land Office, the third was Singapore's Land Registry, and the 4th was the Land System Support Unit, which is now the current organizer of this particular Geo Festival. The first 3 were relatively older. The 4th one, Land System Support Unit, was very young because it was a new unit of technological changes in mapping. So I want to compare just briefly what was the organization at the time when Thomson was appointed the surveyor, government surveyor in Singapore. This is from the directory from 1853. It's more or less similar to when he was appointed in 1841, with some minor changes. Those days, you can see he's appointed here and there. He was also a member of the assessment department, which is almost like the land office that collects the land revenue. And then at the bottom of this chart, you can see survey department. So he was a surveyor under the resident councillor's office. Resident councillor was almost like a deputy governor to the colonial office in Singapore. And under the resident councillor's office, you see that there is a land department and the land office. So in a way, the first 3 departments that formed SLA existed more or less during Thomson's period, albeit that the titles and different organizations. So Thomson reported to several bosses in a way. That makes his work a little complicated. These are just the 2 of the department that he was involved in. The 3rd one he was involved in was the convict department. So he was acting superintendent of convict, and which is also in charge of public works and making new roads. So eventually he was made to work on the lighthouse and so on in civil engineering work. So his life was quite busy at that time. And that sort of contributed to the lack of mapping in the later half of his work in Singapore, because he was very busy with public works and civil engineering works. And one of my favorite quotations of his is from one of these papers that he wrote in 1858 after he left Singapore. This, I must state that upon the whole, as surveyors are made to be killed, so I prefer dumb, vivacious cold air and stout appetite to a hot air and general prostration. This is in reference to his preference to life in a cool New Zealand colonial life, rather than the one here in the hot tropical climate. So he says surveyors are made to be killed. So this is quite a shocking statement, but it's a fact. Surveyors had a very tough life in those days. I think today, they are still quite difficult because they have to stand under the sun and look up into the sky, waiting for the satellite to pass by in the right configuration. Anyway, this is my favorite quotation from Thomson's works. So now I have this outline for today's talk. Briefly, I will go through his timeline, his life, and his career in the Singapore and New Zealand, and followed by his prelude to Singapore very briefly. And the main topic for today is Thomson's maps, and I'll arrange them chronologically. And finally, a little bit on Thomson's legacy. Timeline. First of all, he was born in 1821 in England. It's actually at the border between Scotland and England. His ancestry is from Scotland. And then he came to Penang, actually, via Singapore in 1837. In 1841, he was appointed government surveyor to the Eastern settlements. In those days, it was the Straits settlements, they called it the Eastern settlements, in reference to where India was. This was part of the East India Company at the time still. So this was relative to them, it's part of the Eastern settlements. And in 1844 and 45, he was officiating as superintendent of roads and public works. And this is part of the convict department too. The convicts were doing all the public works in those days. And in 1847 to 1853, he was made to report to the Deputy Surveyor General of Bengal in Calcutta. This is still a bit of a mystery, but what we know is that in 1847, in India, there was a reorganization in the Survey of India's organization, the big department, very big department. And they finally realized that the so-called revenue surveys, that means surveys meant for collecting land rents, had to be reformed. So they appointed a special Deputy Surveyor General in charge of revenue surveys in Bengal, in Calcutta. And this new Deputy Surveyor General was very enthusiastic. So he wanted Thomson to report to him directly, rather than through the chain of command here in Singapore, through the Residence Councillor's office and so on. So those were the interesting days, but it also occurred in the same year that he was assigned to build and design the Horsforth Lighthouse. So sort of like he was dual-hatted. He had to do public works, civil engineering, and this original work in surveying and production of maps. So in 1851, he finally completed the lighthouse. And the next year, 1852 to 53, again, he was made to officiate as the superintendent of convicts, roads, and public works. And he also sat as a member of the municipal committee. So it's more administrative work and a lot of civil engineering work. That took time away from his mapping work. Later, you'll see that there's a lack of maps in the later half of his career here. So he was so tired and exhausted after the lighthouse was completed that in 1853, that he felt that he could no longer stay here and work. So he applied for a home leave, sick leave, and he went back to the UK. So he went back from September 1853 to November 1854. And he returned to Singapore actually in November 1854. And he wanted to apply for a new post in the civil service in Singapore, but there were none to his satisfaction. So he finally resigned in February 1855 and returned to the UK. Never to come back again. And almost close to a year after he left Singapore, he migrated to New Zealand. And his reputation had sort of preceded him in New Zealand, and he was made the chief surveyor of Otago almost the same year, right after he arrived in New Zealand. And he served in that post until 1873. And subsequently, there was a reorganization of the political administration in New Zealand, and he was made the Surveyor General of New Zealand from 1876 and to 1879, when he actually resigned and retired. So in 1884, just a few years later, he died at the age of 63. So that was his timeline, basically. So these are a few known images of him. One of a portrait drawn in 1845 when he was still in Singapore, a photograph taken in 1858 while he's in New Zealand. This is the year that he got married to. And finally, older photograph of him, probably in the 1870s. Now an old distinguished gentleman and former Surveyor General of New Zealand. The last portrait shows three stages of Thomson. So prelude to Singapore. Before he came to Singapore, they were already mapping activities in Singapore, but they were not organized and not systematic. So it was very difficult for the colonial government to sort of administer the land properly. And so Thomson came to this part of the world through his old, how should I say, schoolmates family, the Browns. They had plantations in Penang. So after his studies, at the age of 16, he left home and came to Penang to help in the surveying of the Brown family's plantations in Penang. So this is the map, the copy of a map that he did in 1839. It was quite a good map. 1839, plan of Prince of Wales Island and Province Wellesley. This is the name of Penang in those days. And this sort of established his reputation as a wonderful, good quality surveyor and producer of maps. And after that, because of this thing, and in Singapore, there was someone else, Coleman at that time, George Coleman of Coleman Straits. He was actually the surveyor in Singapore making maps. So this is the map that he produced, the only known map that he produced in 1836, almost contemporary. And this is the rough outline of Singapore Island in 1840. So these are the maps that preceded Thomson's arrival in Singapore. So the maps were not very detailed, not as accurate as after Thomson's arrival and so on. So we end that prelude with this 1820 image, the map done by this James, what's his name again? Franklin, sorry, James Franklin from Survey of India. Actually, he was actually the Quartermaster General, and he made this map in 1822. And this served as the reference outline of Singapore Island for about 2 decades until Thomson's arrival. So that was what Thomson would have seen when he arrived in Singapore, the map data that he had. So now we come to the main section of this talk, Thomson's Maps of Singapore. As I have organized this talk in chronological order, so I have summarized the types of maps in these 6 items. It's difficult to find a good specimen for each, so I used a time approach, so you can see his progression over the years. There are about 6 types of maps that he produced. The first one, the most important for him as in his appointment, was to generate revenue for the government. So he produced cadastral maps. Today we call them cadastral maps. In those days, they are revenue maps, they call it. And then the coastline of Singapore. This is in line, the second type of map is in line with the surveying principle of going from the whole of the area of interest to the parts of the thing. So you need to have the general outline, and then you fill in the details. And then the third one is where he lives, the town of Singapore. So he had done several town maps of Singapore. And then after the town, he approaches move inland to the interior of Singapore. That's the fourth type of map. And then after he had done all the land maps, he explored the waters of Singapore, and he produced a hydrographic chart in collaboration with the Samuel Congalton, a captain of one of the gunships, produced a good chart of this area, as well as, and finally, the 6th type of maps, the areas around Singapore, Johor River and the east coast of Johor. In those days, there were a lot of pirate activities in this area, so it was quite dangerous for Thomson to go alone with just a minimum amount of protection to do his surveys. So these are the 6 types of maps that he used to produce. So now go according to the time. So the first year that he actually came here in November 1841, and he quickly set to work doing surveys. In 1842, he started to produce these district maps. He had 13 district maps made. These district maps covered the coastal and the immediate town area of Singapore, as you'll see later on. This is the first, Claymore District. You can't see it very well because these are badly sort of like deteriorated maps, and they are now in the National Archives of Singapore, so they are quite rare maps. and it's been digitized, so at least we can see the image of it. So this is the title block plan of Claymore district. Claymore is just next to Tanglin area, and at the bottom you can see NO number without the number. The number is supposed to be 1. Claymore district is district number 1. It's closest to where his office was. His office was at the old, how should I say, what's that place? Old court house, which is the old Parliament House today, the art house. The name keeps changing, but that's the area where his office was. Number 1, district number 1. And this is district number 11, Amokia district. Today is Amokyo. Just some examples. Not every district map survived today. In his report, he had 13 district maps. So this is the map that he produced in 1846, part of his chart. And this is a good chart in that it shows the districts that he managed to survey and produce maps of by 1845. So you can see that the majority of the island is still unmapped. The only area is the coastline. So the details have not been filled in. So the only area that he has is the town area and the East Coast area all the way to Changi. So these are the 13 districts that he had of Singapore. So I have, you can see detail, closer detail of the different districts. Okay, I have the, let me see. Oh, I've tabulated the 13 survey districts. Kallang, Toa Payoh Lai, which is Bukit Timah today, and the Bukit Timah proper are missing from this series of district maps in the National Archives of Singapore. The rest are in the collection. The names that are in italics are my speculation based on that this sort of index map in a sense. There are the various names on the maps that appear in the district maps, and some are not there. Then in other reports, he stated that he had produced 13 district maps. So I can sort of like list out 13 names, potential names. So you can see that the maps are produced from 42 to 44. By 45, he had stopped the production of district maps and moved on to some other surveying functions. So next, in 1843, he started his first town map of Singapore, a detailed town map of Singapore. This is the only copy that we know of, and it's actually in the, should I say, National Museum of Singapore's collection. I think it is now stored in the Heritage Conservation Center, HCC in Jurong. I'm not too sure of it, but this is part of the National Museum. This is a copy of that is in the archives collection, a copy of a copy. This is actually a hand-drawn copy of his original printed copy. The original copy is no longer extant. So a small area of Singapore town. And in the same year, in 1842, he managed to complete the new coastline map. Earlier on, I showed a map by James Franklin in 1832. And so he started afresh. He started a fresh coastline map of Singapore. And this is his result. So you can only see the coastline without any interior details. This is Thomson's own. So it was published in 1843. And you see the survey date at the bottom, 1842. So a lot of dedication to the governor and so on, so on and so forth. And his name is at the bottom. So yeah. So after 1843, he expanded his Singapore town map. Originally, you see that there's a narrow strip of Singapore, and now you expanded to almost the suburbs of Singapore, all the way to Katong on the eastern side, and near the Keppel Harbour area in the western side. This is 1844, and it's very few copies survive. This is actually from a black and white copy of a copy again from the National Archives of Singapore. So see, 3rd of April, 1844 at the bottom. Plan of Singapore town and adjoining districts from actual survey by John Turnbull Thomson, government surveyor. National Archives watermark. So in the same year, again, he improved upon his earlier 1842 survey map of Singapore. Now you can see that besides the coastline, he has all the major routes existing by the time he did this survey in 1844. The major routes in Singapore and a lot of names, place names now, scattered over the island. These are mostly the gangs. Today we call them the gangs, the Gambia plantations, the various gangs. that he did. So Singapore Island, surveyed and drawn by J.T. Thomson, government surveyor again, 20th December 1844. So when he had completed the outline, he will start to fill in the detail. So you can see the progress over the years as he did the town map first, and then he now returned to the whole island. So this is a detail of the area of the whole island map. You can see the name like Lim Chu Kang, Chu Chu Kang, Neo Chu Kang, Peng Kang, and Jurong, Pandan, or this is Toa Payoh Lai on the right bottom, Boko Kang, and so on. Some of the names are still around today. And you can see the red lines. The red lines are routes that have been built. And you can see some dashed lines. Those are proposed routes that he wanted to build. Because he was, remember, he was superintending as the supervisor of routes and convicts as well. So he had the responsibility to open up new routes using convict labor. And I think it's too small to see, but there's the word convict lines in this map. So this is the map, the situation of Singapore as he recorded in 1844. So by 1845, some of his work on the coastal area and the town area was incorporated by the British Admiralty. So this is quite a rare accomplishment because the Admiralty at that time only originally use the results from their own Royal Navy surveyors. They do not use the work of outsiders' work. So this was quite an accomplishment for Thomson, so that his work was adapted for a publication in the British Admiralty chart. You can see at the bottom that his name is credited, Mr. J. Thomson. The date is 1842. So next, in 1846. Oh, this is an interesting map for those who are descendants or friends of Tekong Islanders. This is the first ever image of Tekong Island in its proper shape and size. Before this map, Tekong Besar, Tekong Island's shape and size has been distorted due to a lack of proper survey. So in 1845, there was a Royal Navy ship in town to actually combat the pirates. So he took the opportunity to go around the island and did a proper survey. And this is the result of that survey from 1845. So you can see that his name does not appear in the title block. It's credited by a survey by Captain Bethune. His full name is Charles Bethune Drinkwater. So it's a long name. So this is the Royal Navy officer that came here to combat pirates in this area and Borneo. Thomson's name did not appear on this, unfortunately, but Thomson's own the resume had this particular chart in the list of work that he participated. So it's quite significant because after this date, Tekong shape and size, the proper shape and size, is now depicted on Singapore maps, and that Singapore maps started to have the entire Tekong Island depicted after this particular survey and this particular chart was produced. Then in 1846, he returned to update his Singapore town map from 1844. So this becomes a significant map in Singapore's history and Thomson's work. So you can see that this is the same title block from before. Okay. So after he did his this town map in 1846, in the same year, this is actually a monumental work. He actually did a hydrographic survey all the way from Pulau Pisang to Pila Blanca in the South China Sea, a large area. So it has to establish control points in the Riau Islands as well as on the mainland of Malay Peninsula. So this work was done from the end of 1845 to the beginning of 1846 and was published in the 17th of August, 1846 in two charts, two sheets, the Western sheet and the Eastern sheet. So, and interestingly, this was actually his private publication shared with Samuel Congalton, which is the captain of the gunboat that he went on, so that the two of them collaborated on this hydrographic survey. So this is the title block, the Survey of the Straits of Singapore. So it's inscribed respectfully to Colonel Butterworth, who was the governor at that time. So Governor Butterworth was actually quite supportive of his work. So you can see the name Samuel Congalton and J.T. Thomson at the bottom, 1846. That's the original date of the publication of this. Butterworth actually sanctioned the production of this map. Okay, so we come back to these two maps and see the reason why is that at this corner, northeast corner of Bintan Island, you can see it very clearly, but there are at least 5 wrecks from the 1840s recorded in this area alone. So this become a great concern. A lot of ships at that time are turning into steam power and they are going faster. So it's very difficult if you move so fast and there are so much dangerous rocks in this area. So the Butterworth wanted Thomson to do a good hydrographic survey of this area so as to improve the safety of the navigation in this area. In 1845, P&O line start to come here with their steamships. P&O, the famous Peninsula and Orient line. So they started their steamship service here. And so because of all this impending traffic, so they appointed Thomson to make this series of maps. There's always a reason why these expensive surveys were conducted. It's not easy to find out the reason why sometimes. So after this was done in 1846, this is the year that 2 things happened. The survey department in Singapore was asked to report to this newly appointed Deputy Surveyor General of Bengal. And in that year, as part of this new reporting structure, he copied a map of Rochor District, number 2, the map that he produced in 1842, and sent it as part of his report to Bengal. Interestingly enough, this copy of the map is still in the National Archives of India. This is the one that he actually wrote in the dispatch to Bengal in those years ago, that he actually sent this along with his report. And it's quite surprising to see that this actual map still exists. Unfortunately, it is harder to get the original copies of these charts and maps that are in the National Archives of India. It's extremely, how should I say, challenging, to put it very politely. So this is the only map that I know of that was produced by Thomson in 1847, for he was also made to design and build the Hospital Lighthouse in this very year. So the next year, 1848, again, he had to juggle his job between the kind of revenue survey for landlord assignment and assessment, and then he had to do this interesting survey on the northern shore of Singapore, the river mouths and so on, the names and so on, a very detailed survey in 1848, north shore of Singapore. So the title of this is the map of the old Straits of Silat Timbrau, the way he spells it, and the creeks of the north of Singapore Island. That's where Orang Selita and so on, the settlements and all this. He visited all those places and recorded the names. Unfortunately, this map was never published, and this only manuscript copy is now in the National Archives of India. So it's very difficult to access. So this is a copy we have at the National Archives of Singapore, a black and white copy. And here again, I chose this area where there are lots of gangs, various plantation gangs. And you see here, the Chinese character for gang is actually the word lane, a small root lane with the watery radicals, the 3 dots of water. I don't have it here, but that's the original meaning of the word gang. It's actually not harbor or port. It's actually a stream, tributary, a branch of a river. So you can see in this survey that each gang has a river associated with it. So that's the original meaning of the word gang. Actually, some people may not agree, but this is how the original meaning of the word gang is. So it becomes a name for the various plantations in this area. So 1849, that's the year he started to sort of like compile his data. And here is a tweet photograph from Indian Prime Minister Modi's gift to Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong of Singapore when he visited Singapore in 2015. So this is the publicity photograph, and this is the photograph that he tweeted. A color copy of the 1849 town map of Singapore. So you can see that Thomson slowly expanded the scope, the geographical coverage of his town map from the early 1842 edition. A few streets, and then to the suburbs, and now it's the larger area, bigger and bigger area by 1841. So he started to compile and sort of collect the information. Unfortunately, this map was never published. So the only copy is now in the National Archives of India, and we have here a black and white copy in the National Archives of Singapore. It's the same map, actually. It's just a black and white copy, photocopied. So this is the title block. And in this map, for the first time, he started to survey the heights, the 3D, the third elevation of Singapore. Before that, there were no sort of height elevation surveys in Singapore. Or at least they were done, but they were not recorded. But Thomson systematically surveyed the heights, various high grounds in Singapore and recorded them. So for the first time, we have the, say, for example, the heights of Bukit Timah and so on, properly surveyed. And in the same year, in 1849, he compiled, you see the town, and now he expanded to the whole island again. So you can see that pattern. You always have a town map first, and then shortly he will have a whole island map. So same in 1849, his last major effort in this cycle of revision. So this is his map of Singapore Island. And you can see roughly the whole island is similar to the map that he has in the 1846. I just expanded it in some of the details and the graphics in the cartography. This map was reported to have been submitted to Bengal in his report too, but subsequently, it was published in 1852. We'll see later. So in 1849, he again did another major survey on the east coast of Johor. This time, the primary objective was to source for sources of coal fields on the eastern coast of Malay Peninsula. So this is the area you can see Pulau Tioman and the top right, and the Pulau Tinggi area, the Cebu Channel. So it's quite dangerous because there were a lot of pirates in this area. So again, he went to survey with Captain Congalton. So you see the part of eastern coast of Johor and Pahang, together with the islands adjacent, surveyed in 1849. So after the east coast, he surveyed the Johor estuary and various rivers. This was the major survey he did in 1849. Again, unfortunately, this particular map is unpublished too, and it only exists in this manuscript form in the National Archives of India. So in 1850, construction work of Pita Blanca started. And that year, he has no other map except those of Pita Blanca, more of engineering survey than topographical or geographical map, or even revenue map. So this is more like an engineering drawing. This is the Pita Blanca map, 1850. By 1851, Pita Blanca was completed. So this is the sort of like the report map of the location and the area of Horsburgh Lighthouse. You can see the chart of the vicinity, again by John J.T. Thomson, the government surveyor, 1851. Some of the details of this map that he produced. And in 1851, again, the British Admiralty adapted his survey of the new harbour, today the Keppel Harbour area, into a new British Admiralty chart. This is again quite an accomplishment for him as a not even colonial surveyor general. It's part of the East India Company's servant work to be incorporated into the British Admiralty's chart. You can see the title block, The New Harbour by J.T. Thomson, the government surveyor. So his 1849 survey of east coast of Malaya, Johor, and the Johor River was incorporated into this British Admiralty chart in 1851. So this is his work. This is published, but not the rest of his survey. And this is considered as one of the most important work of his in terms of hydrographic survey. So he's not related to Singapore per se, but it's for the source of coal and the security of the area it was later used. Malay Peninsula, the East Coast, Singapore to Tioman by J.T. Thomson, government surveyor. So after this, 1852, essentially he has no new maps. So these are all new old data recompiled and published in 1852. This is the 1849 map that I was talking about. Many people are not aware of the publication of this apparently, because even in the 20th century, the Survey Department of Singapore is still saying that the 1849 map was never published. In fact, there's actually a published copy in 1852. This is the map. It looks almost similar to the 1849 manuscript. And interestingly, this is the only copy known in the world that survives today. No other foreign collections have this map, except it's actually in the National Archives of UK, the only copy left. Singapore, we don't have it here in Singapore, nor anywhere else. 1852. And this map, he has the areas of the various bigger islands of Singapore, including the whole of Singapore. And again, he has this table of all the heights that he surveyed. And the details that he put it up there, the whole of the interior is occupied by pepper and gambia plantations, intermixed with primeval forests. So he has just this general statement in the interior because it's hardly penetrable for a lone surveyor in those days. He had no help in the survey department in his work here. 1843, finally, his health broke down after this prolonged activity from 1847 to 51, building Hospital Flight House. And you can see from 48, 49, he did all this survey, North Shore, Singapore, and Malaya. So he finally applied for sick leave. And so this is the tribute to him in the local papers. And they actually ordered this Ipern, I think the name is Ipern, a memento for him to be made in the UK and delivered to him. And he's back in the UK. And he acknowledged the receipt of this in a letter from Edinburgh in November 1853. He left Singapore in September 1853. I think it's on the 1st of September, if I'm not wrong. So they have this farewell party on the 26th of August, this farewell function to send him off, and speech was given and so on. So he was not known to be coming back to Singapore at that time. It's not certain. So it's almost like a final grand farewell for Thomson. So this is 1853. There was no map produced since 1854. He actually returned to Singapore later in the year, in November. But while he was back in the UK, he actually got this Singapore town map published. And this is very rare surviving reprint copy. The original from 1854 is no longer around. This is actually a 1922, I think, a reprint. And it's also in the National Archives of Singapore collection. So plan of town of Singapore, surveyed in 1842 by government surveyor. No names were given. Thomson is, I think, a little modest, so he doesn't want to brag about his accomplishments. He just wants to get the job done. So March 1854, this is the time when he was in the UK, recuperating. But he was still making maps, getting maps, arranging them for them to be engraved and published. So by November 1854, he returned to Singapore, hoping, as I say earlier, to find a new appointment in the government service, but none were availed. So he finally resigned in 1855 and left Singapore. But deep down, his heart is still with Singapore. And so in 1855, when Raffles Lighthouse was finally commissioned and completed, he actually updated this chart from 1846. So that's why there are two editions. In Singapore, interestingly, we don't have the 1846 edition at all, none. And for the 1855 edition, we only have the western sheet, which is the one I used to show where the survey districts are. The eastern sheet is also not here in Singapore. I think now, according to intelligence, unconfirmed, some government agency has acquired a full set of these two sheets somewhere, but it's not made known to the public yet. So this is the one. The left sheet is the part of the National Archives of Singapore's collection, and the right sheet shown here is from the Royal Geographical Society's collection. So this is the left sheet. So the two places where I've highlighted are the areas that Thomson had added notes indicating that it was updated by him. So these are the top is the text block and the bottom is the title block. So you can see the top, it says the Raffles Light will now form the leading mark, JTT 1855. So we know that the updates in this chart was added by him, by Thomson himself. So at the title block at the bottom, you say additions to 1855. So yeah, so he's still very much attached to Singapore. For he was originally also appointed to design and build the Raffles Lighthouse. But because of ill health, he has to go. And the eventual designer and builder was John Burnett. He was actually the foreman for his Hospital Lighthouse. So he knew Thomson well, and Thomson knew Burnett well. So you can see that the two lighthouses are not identical, just similar looking in the design. So eventually, when the thing was opened in November, probably Thomson would have been informed earlier. For in February 1856, he actually arrived in New Zealand. He migrated to New Zealand. So sometime in the late 1855, he had to set sail from the UK to New Zealand. So probably he received the news earlier so that he could update this chart. And then he was left instructions to be engraved and published. What we see today, the notes on this chart. So this is the eastern half. And there is the edition of the lighthouse on the eastern sheet of this 1855 edition. You can see the 1846 edition, the top, and 1855 edition. The top merely says Prida Bangko, Batu Puteh. And the bottom one, more words, hospital lighthouse, rural, the revolving light, and so on, the details of the light, and middle rocks. So in the past, it was soft rocks, and now becomes middle rocks. So that's the two difference, subtle difference, but you can see the difference between the two editions of this chart. So I want to summarize the Thomson's chart. It's quite a bit. So I've selected these few, which I think are significant in the study of Singapore's mapping history, as well as the usefulness of these several charts, which I'll highlight for researchers of history of Singapore, especially in the town area or the development of Singapore. This is the 1854 town plan that he published, but the information on it are the original land lots in the town area of Singapore as surveyed in 1842. And then followed by the Singapore town, where you can see the layout of the streets and some of the agricultural activities in the immediate vicinity around Singapore town from 1846. Next, followed by the 1849, this one. Let's appeal to the Prime Minister's office to make a copy of this, to make it available for the public to at least use it or consult this particular map. This has been kept from the public view since 2015. It has been made known by Modi, Prime Minister Modi of India. We have a black and white copy of this in the National Archives of Singapore. That's part of Singapore's original collection. In those days, if you need a map, you will ask a draftsman or someone who can draw to trace the map. Literally every detail, even the mystics, everything, you'll follow exactly the same and make a copy. So this colorful copy was sent to India, and there were 2 working copies retained in Singapore, and they are now in the National Archives of Singapore. Each copy has slight differences because of a different time it was copied and by different people, probably. So this is the best copy that is not here. And this whole island map of Singapore shows the entire realm of Singapore as a settlement of Singapore under the East India Company, with some of the heights, the elevations of certain high points in Singapore. It's one of the interesting features of this particular map. And that's the first of the many editions. Subsequently, every few years, Survey Department of Singapore will produce identically titled Map of Singapore Island and its dependency maps until the 1910s and 20s, and even by the military until the 1930s. There's almost 80 years of continuous production of this series of maps. And then this, the 2-sheet Strait of Singapore. This has a lot of details, and it's very interesting for study of the navigation of Singapore waters and the places and the coastline. And this East Coast map of Thomson is also significant for the study of Malaysia Peninsula. And of course, this map, this is my favorite of Thomson's maps. Okay, now finally we come to the last section, Thomson's legacy, international, national, and personal. So internationally, after he moved to New Zealand, he introduced a new system of survey in New Zealand after he became Surveyor General. In New Zealand, it's known as the New Zealand Meridional Circuit System. After studying the details, this is the Meridional Circuit diagram of New Zealand from the Government Survey Department. I find that there are much similarities between the Meridional system and the survey districts that he introduced to Singapore. So these are the circuit that was introduced by Thomson on the left, the original chart, and this is the update after the modernization of the system. New Zealand government decided to retain the meridional circuit system when there was a chance for them to start afresh in 2000 when they wanted to change the mathematical details, everything of New Zealand. But they decided that this system works for them, and they retained it, and then they based this system on the new satellite surveying system. And that's quite interesting. So this is the circuit. It looks like our district, the Rochor district, the Claymore district, and so on. Although this is much larger, but this is like a scalability issue. So this is the district of Singapore, although it's not completed in Singapore, but it looks similar in design. So this is my observation. The circuit system in New Zealand and the districts in Singapore. So Thomson had this idea of having a proper survey, control and everything. But he was not able to complete because of his various responsibilities and the equipment, inferior equipment that he had while in Singapore. So when he becomes Surveyor General in New Zealand, he had all the resources, manpower, and by then more advanced, how should I say, the techniques that he was available to him. So he actually did the job properly, and it was completed for the entire New Zealand. But in Singapore, it was more of a test and started the thing. So this is what I think is his legacy internationally. What we have here was actually improved upon, and it worked in New Zealand today. Then we come to our own national legacy, Singapore's landlords. These are things that we don't usually see, but to the Land Office, the SLA, is very important. I come back to this. That's why I say this is interesting. This map is important because he recorded the original landlords that was set up, drawn by him, or determined, delineated by him. And some of the lots are still around today. So on the right, I have the map from the lots from the area in downtown area. And on the middle and the left are the two layers in the one map portal. You can see some of the lots are still around, although the surface configuration, the houses and the buildings built on top of it, on the left, extreme left, may not be the same, but you can still see some of the divisions of the lots are still around in Singapore's landscape. This is an invisible area. We can't really see it. It's actually very administrative and mathematical today. It's all in the database now, captured in database or old charts. On the right is the old original configuration by Thomson. Incidentally, this is too technical. Each landlord has his own number. I can see some of these figures in the middle image. The numbers are totally different from Thomson's era and today's. Today's is very computerized. And even Thomson's original numbers were later changed when the revamp to the Singapore Land Admin System and Survey System was improved upon in the several decades that followed Thomson's departure. But the outline, the physical area is almost retained in this more dense area of Singapore town. So that's his legacy in Singapore. Personally, well, sorry, talk about me. I find this rock very interesting. This picture on the left, it's one of the paintings that Thomson did on a trip back to the UK. Interestingly, when I was in the studying in Scotland, we make a day trip to the area. And a friend of mine took a photograph of me admiring the sea. It turned out that this is the same piece of rock, base rock in Scotland. So this is the location of base rock. And you can see Edinburgh. So I was studying Edinburgh. So you make a day trip over there to take a look at the sea. So that's for me personally. And here is for Thomson. In New Zealand, they finally raised a monument to commemorate his work, not just surveying, and a lot of civil engineering work, public works in New Zealand. So they set up a monument in Ranfurly, and the South Island, near Dunedin, to commemorate his work. And this is the plaque, this is information at the bottom of that monument. So he is actually a civil engineer by then, fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. His date of birth and death, and his appointment as Chief Surveyor of Otago and Surveyor General of New Zealand. It's Thomson commemorated in New Zealand personally. And this is the late Dr. John Ho Jones, great-grandson of John Turnbull Thomson. He was actually the custodian of Thomson's information, historical information, and a lot and information and legacy. He was the custodian, and I wrote to him in 2012. He passed away in Dr. John Ho Jones passed away in 2015, and in 2012 I wrote to him, and this is his handwritten reply. I asked a lot of simple questions, and he also do not have much information about Thomson's stay in Singapore. He has a lot of information after his arrival in New Zealand, but not so much about his work life and work prior to his arrival in New Zealand. So that's unfortunate. So he couldn't answer a lot of details too, pertaining to my questions. But I'm glad that I actually wrote to him. And actually, I was so surprised to receive a reply, handwritten some more, in this day and age of modern technology from him. So another personal thing, interesting thing about Thomson is that he apparently really loved his stay here in Malaya and Singapore. For in this marriage notification, 1858, he got married. Look at his house name, Sri Minanti. This is actually the royal town in Negeri Sembilan. And in Singapore, there's actually a Sri Minanti estate owned by George Garden Decor. This area is still depicted in our street directory in 1954. Actually, it's much later, until 70s. We still have it, Sri Minanti Estate, Jervois Road area, and Chatsworth Park area. That's the entire area under Sri Minanti Estate. So Thomson's original house apparently was named after this estate, or the royal town in Negeri Sembilan. So his heart is really sort of like part of it stayed here in this area. New Zealanders are not familiar with the word Sri Minanti, but I find interesting that in his original house, it was named after a place here. And in the 2019 and 2020, the National Library of Singapore organized this on paper exhibition. It's more of the part of the bicentennial celebration of Singapore. Unfortunately, the ending of this exhibition was disrupted by this current inconvenience. So a lot of exhibits were not fully appreciated. Part of the exhibition, we had on loan from the University of Otago in New Zealand, 16 of Thomson's paintings. He loved to paint. If he had been born today, I think he would fully embrace Instagram. He would check in at every location that he's visited by doing a painting and documenting the date and the place and some description briefly. So this is one of the paintings that was used on the commemorative book for the National Library's exhibition. Very, very colorful. Today, this is really how it looked like, the color after 100 over years in the collection. So he had 203 paintings in the University of Otago's collection, the last time I checked the collection. And I've identified, or sort of like picked up 74 names, and I plotted on this Google map to show the locations where he had sort of like checked in, the location that he had checked in. So you can see there are 3 major clusters. Of course, where he was born, place of born, the UK original place, then where he worked, Singapore area, Malaya, and then finally where he migrated to, and eventually set up his family and died in New Zealand. So there's 3 clusters of places. Now, the interesting thing to me, after studying all these places, is that he arranged for a circumnavigation of the world. Knowing him, he's this kind of adventurer and traveler. He actually arranged it. Look at the lines of travel. So originally he set out from UK to come to Penang via Singapore. So that's the pinkish looking line. So when he returned to the UK in 1853, he took this route, because based on the check-in locations of his painting, we know that he went to Sri Lanka, Aden, Cairo, Sicily. He passed by Sicily and Gibraltar. So that's the only logical route that he would take. That's the sailing route as well, before the Suez Canal was open. So there was a short overland route in the Egypt area after the Red Sea. So he went back there. So he made another route to come to New Zealand. So again, the pink line, followed by the grayish line to New Zealand. So it covered the half the world by then. And in 1878, during his surveyor generalship, he actually took a few months off, almost a year off, to visit UK again. He is known to be back in the UK because of some of the other papers that he published, as well as his painting. So we know that he was in the UK. And what the location of his painting indicated that he actually reached Honolulu, and then within a few days, short days, he reached Nevada and Wyoming and Niagara Falls. That's the 3 dots in the North American continent. So that would probably have taken by train at that time. And the ship would have been a steamship, not a sailing ship, a wind-powered ship. And then the next point that he had is back to the UK. So essentially, the 1876 route is actually a full circumnavigation of the world. So we are now all sitting at home admiring at other people's travelogue and photographs. And I find it interesting that I get to see Thomson's travels through his paintings. He's one of those people who really enjoyed life. And he had a good life. He had set up his family. He did what he loved to do. And one of the things that he didn't realize he had was the fortune that he had was that he had a good boss. He had a very good boss here in Singapore, Butterworth. Butterworth admired him, respected him, and let him do what he wanted to do. There was no sort of like, you can't do this, I'm not going to approve this, during his 13 years of active work in Singapore. Although in his own sort of like book, Glimpses of Life in the Far East, he dedicated a whole chapter saying bad things about his boss. So it's quite interesting to see that today, that's why they have this 360 peer review system. It's quite interesting to see how I see my boss and how my boss sees me. The boss really respected him, but perhaps not so from Thomson's perspective. And this is my last slide, and thank you for listening in. Stay healthy, and thank you and goodbye. Okay. Oh, I've got questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, hope everyone has. Yeah. So we do have a short Q&A. We can take on a few questions before we end the session. Let me just
so many questions.
Take one of the questions.
I wasn't prepared for this.
Okay. Okay, what were the surveying techniques used for Thomson's map, where there are any distortions to the land?
The surveying techniques that Thomson used was it's really not non-standard. He in those days they were using this almost like a theodolite or level, depending on what he's surveying. So even for the 2D surveying, he had to make do with sextant. Sextant is meant to see the attitude of the sun, but because he lacked the kind of theodolite, so he laid the sextant horizontally. So to use that to find the horizontal angle. So it's quite inferior. So he actually wrote about this, that he had this inferior tools. So he wasn't satisfied with his survey in Singapore. And the results show that the maps that he produced, so subsequently he actually gave up on doing the proper kind of high accuracy survey. So that was one of the techniques that was using the thing. So he was using river banks as reference points, trees and so on. So those are not permanent structures. So next time you go there, the tree may be missing. So some of the things that he wrote about, there's still no complete study on the techniques that he used, because some of the writings are embedded in something known as the Straits Settlements Record, letters to the resident councillors, and that takes a lot of time to read and transcribe. So I'm not too familiar with the actual techniques that he used, but he had all these things. And one of the things that he mentioned was that because he had no assistance, in those days, surveyings are relative positioning. Not like today, we have GPS. So you take the thing and stand there, they'll tell you exactly what is the latitude and longitude, for example. In those days, you are relative using bearing and distance. So you have to find the angle towards some known point and then measure the distance. So you have to set up some permanent target or conspicuous target some distance away where you can look at it, and you note down the distance from where you're observing to where the target is, plus the angle to it, and so on and so forth. So you form sort of like a series of network of triangles. So what he did was actually he had to row a boat to, say, a hill in the Johor side in order to get the coastline of Singapore. Right? So he had to sail, sort of like row a boat across to one of the hills in Malaya, in Johor, set up a target conspicuously. He thought it's conspicuous. So when he came back, he couldn't see the target. So he had to roll back there and readjust the target. So this was some of the things that he had to do, and he was exhausted just to do a simple, today it would be a relatively simple survey. So this is one of the techniques that he used. But because he lacked the manpower to help him. And then, of course, for measuring distance, they have a chain gang. So he actually used convict labels to help him lay out the, sort of like take the chain, literally the chains in those days, to measure the horizontal distance and so on. So these are some of the things that we know, but he did not leave very detailed accounts. This is actually one of the questions I asked Dr. John Ho Jones, but he did not have a writing recorded in his collection too. And in terms of distortion to the land, because he was measuring a relatively small area, so the distortion wasn't that big. And anyway, for revenue survey, the surveyors assume that the earth is flat. That's the basis of their survey mathematics for revenue surveys. If you move to topographical surveys, like topo maps, or those long distance surveys for continental size, then they use different types of mathematics to assume the shape and size of the earth. For Singapore, for revenue surveys, they assume the earth is flat. Does that answer the question?
Take on two more questions. Next question, were there any differences in the content and style of maps made by West versus East during this period? Was surveying a Western construct?
Oh, yes, definitely. Surveying in this sense was a Western construct, because the Chinese, they have actually a treatise on surveying, but the mathematics used to compute was different. And then in terms of the content and style, content-wise is actually up to the who is commissioning the map. If you are the revenue surveyor, you would like to map out where crops are being grown, what properties are being built, the things that can generate money, tax. So if the military commissioned by the military, you have a different purpose, where to build a camp, where to defend yourself, and so on. So the style of the maps are actually, in terms of within their own culture, have their own different contents and style because of the purpose of the map that you have been asked to produce. Yeah, so that's the big difference. In terms of East and West, very big difference, especially during Thomson's era. At that time, well, in terms of East and the West, you're assuming the Europeans. In terms of East, the most powerful East at that time was the Qing dynasty. They have regressed into painting style of mapping by Thomson's era for some reason. They have adopted the Western standard way of depicting a map in the 1600s, but by 1800s somehow has regressed as in moved back to the old Ming dynasty of painting style mapping. So during the Thomson's period, China's mapping has become 200 years before. Does that answer the question?
Okay, for the benefit of time, I think let's take on one more last question.
Okay.
So Thomson became a government surveyor at the age of 20. Is it common during that era?
Uncommon. It's very uncommon. Actually, before Thomsons were appointed, there was actually someone, D.H. Stevenson. He was a military officer. And he depending on who you are, he's the one that accused now by modern Singaporeans of blowing up the Singapore stone at the mouth of Singapore River. He was the acting settlement engineer in the public account. And he was actually the superintendent of convict public roads for about a year in 1843 to 44. And that's when, as part of the improvement work, he blew up the rock. But story is that in 1840, he was actually proposed by the authorities, the East India Company, to take up the post of government surveyor in Singapore. But for some reason, because he's a military man, he has no choice. his military bosses overruled the decision or something. So Stevenson was not did not take up the post. So they have to look for someone else. So someone else happened to be Thomson, who had done that 1839, the wonderful map of Penang. So it was luck and plus his abilities at that time. So that he really, that's why I say the Butterworth himself is actually a qualified surveyor. He published, his name is in the published list of surveyors and cartographers as well. So he said he won't be the surveyor general or the chief surveyor, so he's looking for someone else. And Thomson happened to publish that map. So it's just nice that the military officer declined that job and Thomson was in the area. So that's the history, how it worked out. So it's uncommon for someone 20 years old to be appointed such an important post. Although here it was not a very important settlement at that time, regarded by the surveyor of India HQ.
Yeah, I think we do have quite good response from the audience. So there are a few more questions. If you don't mind,
no problem, no problem.
A few more.
If I can answer, I'll try to answer that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, the next question. The Amokia district on Thomson map, where is the present area? On the map, it does not seem to be Ang Mo Kio.
Yeah, it's not. It is not. The area has moved. Amokia area is Serangoon Route and the junction of Paya Lebar Route today. You know, Serangoon Route and Paya Lebar Route, the junction area, the area where these two routes meet, that used to be the Amokia area. So it's nowhere near Ang Mo Kio of today.
Okay, next question. Who had access to the Singapore town maps made by Thomson, and what were the purposes of these maps? How big were these maps?
Oh, those are when they were being made, of course, they were made for revenue purposes, and the revenue as in money, taxation, again for the government. But if those that were published, like those 1844 and 1846, sorry, the two editions, those are meant for sale. So anyone interested in a copy can just buy it for general knowledge or understanding of the terrain. And as for 1849, again, primarily that was meant for the government's own use. But if it had been published, it would probably have been for sale as well. Because Thomson is a, how do they say, I don't know what's the word. He was a servant of the East India Company, but he was free to sell his products, services, with the approval of the East India Company. So this, depending on whether it was published or not. Once it's published, it's available for sale to the public. If not, then the government owns the thing.
Next question. Was Thomson's survey of the Selat Tebrau for the 1848 map the first ever survey of the Tebrau Strait?
Yes, that's the most detailed survey of the Tebrau Strait at that time, up to that time. The previous surveys did not note down all the river mouths, the known so-called Chinese settlements around the area, and so on. So that was the first detailed survey. Unfortunately, it was not published.
I think that's all the questions we've got. Thank you so much, Mok, for this session. I think it has been very insightful, looking through the history of mapping in Singapore and also history on Thomson himself. Thank you very much, Mok. And for those who have more questions for Mok, perhaps you can drop. Do you have an email address that you can share out?
Me?
Yes.
Do I type here or what?
You can just type in the chat.
Okay. Okay, that's my email. Should you have any other questions which I can answer? Yeah, there are still, unfortunately, many unknowns. One of the unknowns is that in 1845, Thomson attempted to do a proper survey. So he actually did a triangulation map of Singapore that was dispatched to Bengal. We have not seen it today. So if anyone out in the world has come across a mysterious map with a lot of triangles on it, and it links to 1840s, yes, that could be Thomson's survey triangulation map of Singapore. So there are still a lot of these missing and unaccounted maps that was produced as part of his work in Singapore. Even Dr. John Ho Jones is not aware of such maps because apparently Thomson did not bring his record of his service in Singapore to New Zealand. So he started almost afresh. Yeah, except for the two books from his memory he wrote about the glimpses of life in the Far East. Yeah, and more memories of those. Yeah.
Okay. Once again, thank you to all our audience for attending this wonderful talk by Mok La Ying. Once again, Mok, thank you so much for
Thank you for the
this
invitation
presentation.
and the opportunity to share this, especially on this auspicious occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.